and they'll walk out to the bleachers and sit in shirt sleeves on a perfect afternoon. They'll find they have reserved seats somewhere along one of the baselines where they sat when they were children and cheered their heroes. And they'll watch the game, and it'll be as if they've dipped themselves in magic waters. The memories will be so thick they'll have to brush them away from their faces. The one constant through all the years, Ray, has been baseball. America has rolled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. But baseball has marked the time. This field, this game, it's part of our past, Ray. It reminds us of all that once was good and could be again. A quote from the character Terrence Mann, played by the famous James Earl Jones in the movie Field of Dreams. Shouldn't be lost on anyone that that movie centered around a primary baseball character of Sheila's Joe Jackson and his Black Sox buddies, who were all banned from baseball for life after the scandal of 1919's World Series. Baseball had already captured America's imagination in its first roughly 40 to 50 years of existence in a way that no other sport had. By 1920, the American and National Leagues were playing annually in a World Series that was still fairly young, the first one being in 1903, but already was the premier sporting event in America at the time. And despite the fact that gambling had actually been a part of the game for as long as the game had really been around, the fans couldn't fathom that the World Series could be fixed. Not the World Series, the Fall Classic. Certainly not. We all like to believe in the purity of baseball. But as we know in the early 21st century, and even recently, it's not always the case. Humans will be humans, people will be people. Sometimes greed wins out. The story of the 1919 Black Sox is both tragic and, in some ways, a story of the saving of the game of baseball. Baseball very well could have been ruined by this scandal. There were many moving parts to this, multiple gamblers, multiple players, and perhaps the greatest irony, the saddest part, or maybe you could call it justice, most of the players involved never got the amount of money they were promised. Gamblers shockingly reneged on payments, and they lost their livelihood. And for many of them, they lost the thing they loved and cherished the most, being able to play the kids' game for a living. Even though at the time that living wasn't what it is today for today's players, for many of those players, it was all they knew. It was a way to make money without having to work in a mine or a warehouse and do hard labor. So the story of the Black Sox is both tragic and at the same time, maybe it was justice for some of them. The main thing that endures from this scandal is baseball has to keep itself as pure as it possibly can. It was a harsh punishment for these 8 men, but it had to happen. And as this series goes along, we'll discuss all the ins and outs of that punishment and how the players ended up and dive a little deeper into their stories. But in this first episode, we just want to set the scene. So as this series premieres on Thanksgiving night, if you're listening to it on that night, I hope you've had an incredible Thanksgiving holiday with your family and friends, been able to enjoy some amazing food, maybe a little drink, probably watch some football. But now it's Thanksgiving evening. Maybe you're going to have some leftovers. Pour you a glass of bourbon or wine, whatever your preferred drink might be. And listen to our podcast as we premiere a new series focused solely on the historical aspect of the game. And we chose this particular story because of its infamy, frankly. Perhaps the most infamous story in baseball history, throwing the World Series. Seems pretty unfathomable now. In the 21st century, we've obviously experienced a different kind of cheating, but this is so much worse, it seems. The World Series is sacred, the Fall Classic. When it didn't happen in 1994, those of us who lived through it still don't like to think about it. Even worse, trying to think about a World Series being rigged, players intentionally throwing games. Mm, too much for me to handle. That's why I hope this story stays in the past. It's great to relive it as a lesson. Let's hope we never have to relive it again in modern day. Let's set the stage. It's 1919 in America. We've just been through a world war. We discovered jazz, and we pretty much crowned baseball our king. Nowhere was the kingdom brighter than on Chicago's south side, where the White Sox looked unstoppable. Along with that, there was an air of hope, optimism. The war was over, things seemed different, and Americans wanted to go out and do something fun. And baseball provided that outlet. But behind all the cheers, behind the uniforms and the glory and the crack of the bat, there were cracks showing in the game itself. So the story you're about to listen to is not just about a game or series thrown for money. When you think about that speech from James Earl Jones's character in Field of Dreams, it's about faith. It's about the fans' faith in the game. It's about pride. It's about players believing they deserve more. And it's the kind of love for a game that can turn into betrayal. This is Romantic About Baseball, the Black Sox Scandal. Baseball in the 1910s was the working man's stage. Players rode on trains. They wore wool in the middle of July, and they got paid a fraction of what they earned for their owners. Charles Comiskey, nicknamed the Old Roman, ran his White Sox like a business empire built on nickels and loyalty. Comiskey was nicknamed the Old Roman because of some physical traits, but mostly his personal characteristics, such as his strong, imposing presence and traits like discipline, vision, purpose. Comiskey was born in Chicago in 1859, the son of an Illinois politician. He attended several public and parochial schools in Chicago, played baseball at St. Mary's, and for several professional teams in Chicago, while he also apprenticed to be a plumber. In fact, Comiskey actually drove a brick delivery wagon for the construction crews building the fifth Chicago City Hall, which stood from 1873 to 1885. Comiskey started his playing career as a pitcher and moved to first base after developing arm trouble. He is credited with being the first player to play hitters off of first base, enabling him to cover more balls hit to the infield. He entered the American Association in 1882 with the St. Louis Brown Stockings. He managed that team during parts of its first 3 seasons and became the full-time manager in 1885. He led the Browns to 4 consecutive American Association championships and a close second place in 1889. Comiskey also played for and managed the Chicago Pirates in the Players League in 1890, the Browns again in 1891, and the Cincinnati Reds in the National League from 1892 to 1894. Comiskey left Cincinnati and the majors in the fall of 1894 to purchase the Western League Sioux City Cornhuskers in Sioux City, Iowa, and he moved them to St. Paul, Minnesota, renaming the team the St. Paul Saints. Comiskey had compiled a .264 batting average with 29 homers, 883 RBI, and 419 stolen bases in his playing career. As a manager, Comiskey had posted an .839 and .542 record. And after 5 seasons of sharing the Twin Cities with another Western League club in Minneapolis, Comiskey and his colleagues arranged to share Chicago with the National League, whose club, the Chicago Cubs today, played on the west side. The St. Paul Saints moved to the south side as the White Stockings, also the original name of the Cubs, by the way. And that was eventually shortened to White Sox. This newly formed White Sox team was joining the new American League for the 1900 season. And then the American League declared itself a major league starting in 1901. Comiskey worked with, at the time, a friend of his, Ban Johnson, to create the new American League, a response to the rough and tumble National League. Johnson plays a pivotal part in this story a little later on, but suffice it to say, without Comiskey and Johnson, there would have been no American League. As owner of the White Sox from 1900 until his death in 1931, Comiskey oversaw the construction of Comiskey Park in 1910 and won 5 American League pennants, 1900, 1901, 1906, 1917, and of course, 1919. They also won two World Series during that time, 1906 and 1917. But Comiskey lost some popularity with his players and became despised by many. He was notoriously stingy. Defenders might call him frugal, but Comiskey was notorious for saving a nickel where he could, even forcing his players to pay to launder their own uniforms, which is actually where the term Black Sox began, not with the scandal, but with their dirty uniforms when the players refused to pay for their own laundry. In an era where professional athletes lacked free agency, the White Sox formidable players had little choice but to accept Comiskey's substandard wages. Now, it's here that it should be noted that according to the Society for American Baseball Research, commonly known as SABR, they have disputed and debunked many of the stories and myths surrounding the novels and movies about this Black Sox scandal. According to SABR, the White Sox of 1919 had one of the highest payrolls in baseball. And in fact, Eddie Cicotte, pitcher, ace pitcher of the White Sox, notoriously disgruntled about pay, supposedly, was actually the second highest paid pitcher in the bigs behind only the big train Walter Johnson. That's not to say the wages were fair to the players, especially compared to what the owners were making. Far from it. But perhaps Comiskey was not as cheap as he's been made out to be. The reason for these myths, who knows? 1919, not exactly a time when you had a lot of media. You didn't have recordings, television, internet. But also, some of the stories seem to side with the players, and maybe rightfully so. Because despite having one of the better payrolls, it's still obvious the players were not being paid what they were earning for the owners in comparison. There is another common myth, by the way. If you've seen the movie Eight Men Out or read the novel, you may have heard this story that Cicotte was denied a $10,000 bonus that he was supposed to earn for winning 30 games in a season, and that Comiskey famously had him sit on the bench for 2 weeks to deny him a chance to win those 30 games and trigger the $10,000 bonus. SABR has pretty much thoroughly debunked this as a myth for several reasons, among which include a $10,000 bonus in that time would have been pretty much unheard of, and there's no actual record of this anywhere. Cicotte was never apparently intentionally benched for any other reason than injury. So some of the myths surrounding this scandal that seem to play to the players' favor could just be a way of making the players look a little better and maybe not as greedy. The greed certainly plays a part in this story, and it can't be denied. So back to Comiskey. He did lose popularity. He was known as a bit of a cheapskate at times. Comiskey famously wined and dined the media, while perhaps withholding some of these same things for his own team. Comiskey took care of the media, so I would imagine the media would take care of him. Comiskey also defended baseball's very infamous reserve clause in a court case in 1914. Now, the reserve clause was instituted by the National League in 1879. And what it did was basically meant that the contractual rights to a player could be retained by a team even after the expiration of the player's contract. As long as the team renewed his contract annually, which the team could do unilaterally, the player had no ability to enter into a contract with anybody else. The team with a player's contract could reassign, trade, or sell that player at will. The player would only become a free agent if he was released by the team or if his team did not renew his contract. By preventing players from voluntarily moving between teams, the reserve clause kept salaries low. Team owners claimed it prevented wealthy teams from hoarding the best players and ruining the competitive balance of baseball. All that to say, some things never change. This was 1914. We're now in 2025, still having these same conversations. But in 1914, first baseman Hal Chase had successfully challenged the reserve clause in court. And of course, this angered the baseball owners, including Comiskey. And maybe coincidentally, or maybe not, rumors of Chase's involvement in gambling and throwing games increased after that decision. And whether it was because of his actual throwing of games or his challenging the powers that be or some combination of the two, Chase was effectively blackballed from baseball, even though he was never convicted or officially banned. Baseball had long been rumored to have players throwing games for bettors, even back to a scandal in Louisville in 1877. But baseball had largely turned a blind eye to the issue. With Hal Chase gaining attention in 1918 and then 1919 coming along, baseball's reputation was about to take a hit. And actually, the game itself might have taken a permanent hit, if not for how some things worked out. Not so much in the players' favor, but in the game's favor. Despite Comiskey's noted cheapness, this team stayed together because winning and maybe pride still mattered more than money until it didn't. And understand, too, that this White Sox team had deep division in its own clubhouse. There were two distinct groups in the clubhouse, one led by future Hall of Famers Eddie Collins and catcher Ray Schalk. Collins was a Columbia grad, a rich boy, if you will. And that's the way that some of his teammates viewed him. Collins kind of led what you would call the straight shooters of the group. On the other side were the guys led by Chick Gandil and Swede Riceberg. Joe Jackson would have been part of this group. In fact, all of the guys implicated in the scandal would have belonged to Gandil and Riceberg's group. Gandil was the tough guy, Riceberg as well. They were the muscle. And these two groups did not get along. And in fact, from what we know, they didn't really even talk to each other outside of the baseball field. Maybe this contributed to some of what happened in this story. Maybe not. But it should be noted there was definite division. We'll talk about the White Sox more in depth individually in episode 2 and also talk about their manager. But as an overview, let's talk about some of the guys involved directly in the scandal. Now, again, remember, these guys were a masterpiece in spikes. They were mostly the same team that had whipped the Giants in the 1917 World Series. You had Eddie Cicotte, the knuckleballing ace. Quote, Cicotte could make a baseball dance, but the man himself was tired, bitter, and broke. The Chicago Tribune, October 1920. Cicotte had won over 200 games with a 2.38 ERA in his 14-year career. Shoeless Joe Jackson, perhaps the most famous of this group. Illiterate, but an artist with the bat. Quote, Joe could hit it a mile, but you could fool him easy with a pen. Chicago Herald and Examiner, 1920. Now, Joe Jackson had amassed a .356 career batting average and had over 200 stolen bases in 13 seasons. Ty Cobb once said Jackson was the greatest hitter he'd ever seen. Jackson would hit .375 with a then record 12 hits and the only home run of the 1919 World Series. He also committed no errors. His involvement and knowledge of what was actually happening has been hotly debated throughout the years, but by the numbers, at least, it would appear that Jackson played as hard as he could. It is known and admitted by Jackson himself he took $5,000, but nobody's sure if Jackson actually knew what was going on. He wasn't dumb per se, but he was a country boy and uneducated and perhaps easy to manipulate. But the bottom line was Jackson just wanted to play ball. Then you had Chick Gandil, the ringleader, it appears. Hard as Chicago pavement. Along with Riceberg, he recruited the others like Happy Felch, Lefty Williams, and Fred McMullen. Names that now echo in baseball infamy, but without this scandal, probably largely would have been forgotten. Then there was Buck Weaver, who we'll also talk more about in episode 2. Weaver played hard in the World Series in 1919. He batted .324. He had 11 hits, second only to Jackson's 12. Weaver admitted he was in the room during one of these meetings to fix the World Series, but took no money and did nothing during the series to throw a game. Unfortunately for Buck, he was still implicated with the other players and would end up banned from baseball. More on him in episode 2. A comment here, a remark there. You work your arm to the bone and the doctor pay for a dirty shirt. Eddie Seacott. Then maybe it's time we take what's owed to us. Chick Scandal. It started as frustration, but frustration has a way of finding opportunity. The players were underpaid, overworked, and angry. Perfect soil for a rotten crop. New York Times, 1920. It was no secret the gamblers were thick as flies around Comiskey Park. Chicago Daily News, 1919. Somewhere between Chicago saloon smoke and the roar of Comiskey Park, a whisper became a plan. Gandil, the team's muscle, had friends in low places. Gamblers with big wallets and bigger appetites. Gandil would say, "We ain't crooks, fellas. We're just making it even." Seacott would ask, "You really think we can pull this off?" And Gandil said, "They'll never know." They never do. By the end of August, these whispers had turned into numbers. $10,000 a man to drop a few games. For some, it was temptation. For others, you might call it justice. Now, $10,000 in 1919 probably works out to over $100,000 in 2025 money. So not a small amount, especially to these men. Because remember, whether they were highly paid compared to their peers or not, there's no question that players in general of that era were underpaid compared to what those owners were making. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was a feeling of wanting to get back at those rich guys. Because if you'll notice, it's the clique that didn't come from money that led the charge on this. Eddie Collins wasn't involved. Ray Schalk wasn't involved. So the disgruntled group, the disgruntled clique, led the way in this scandal. Chicago in 1919, a city on the make. You had stockyards and speakeasies, and a shadow economy built on bets. Gamblers were everywhere. Perhaps the biggest gambler in America at the time was Arnold Rothstein, called the Big Bankroll. He would watch from New York, quietly funding schemes that never left a paper trail. And it'd actually be one of Rothstein's underlings that initiated one of the schemes with the players without Rothstein's approval, apparently. Abe Attell, a former professional boxer, had promised payments to the players as the games progressed, but he kept coming up short on the payments. Meanwhile, the team had kind of hedged its bets and set up separate payment plans with another infamous gambler, Sport Sullivan from Boston. As I mentioned earlier, maybe the most ironic or justifiable part of all this is the players never did receive all the money they were promised from any of the gamblers. Can't trust a gambler. Who can you trust, right? Rothstein never saw the games, never met the players. He didn't need to. His money traveled where he could. The gamblers pretty much got off scot-free in all this. And we'll talk about that more in episodes 2 and 3. But ironically, the people who really set this up and supplied the money are the ones who are going to be left untouched in all this. They say the streets of Chicago smell like money and mud. Sometimes you can't tell the difference. Attributed to a reporter. Baseball is supposed to be pure, but purity is a tough sell in a town built on hustle. We all want to believe in baseball. That's why we're here. That's why we have a podcast called Romantic About Baseball. And sometimes we certainly overlook the ugly side of the game. We don't like to think about these scandals. We even romanticize them. Like Field of Dreams, my favorite baseball movie. But it romanticizes this in a way that gives you sympathy for the players, even though they chose what they did. Then there's segregation. It's tragic that baseball wasn't fully integrated until 1947. But we still love the game, and we want to believe in the purity of the game. And this scandal certainly makes you think. So now it's September 29th of 1919. The White Sox clinched the American League pennant. Comiskey's smiling for the cameras. He's hobnobbing with his reporter buddies. He's on top of the world because the one thing Comiskey wanted more than anything else was to win pennants. Winning is what mattered, and he wanted another world title, and he seemed to have it within his grasp. But while some of his players celebrated, a few of them kept their eyes on the Reds were up next, and the White Sox will be heavy favorites. So not only were the Reds next, but so was opportunity. Now, no one in that room could have known that a century later, we'd still be asking why. Why did they do it? What did it cost the game? We know what it cost the players. So, yes, we're all romantic about baseball. We all want to believe in the purity of the game. Because, once again, as said by James Earl Jones, the one constant through all the years has been baseball. America's rolled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. But baseball has marked the time. And in these early days, it was so important to protect the game. And what happened in this scandal, if it hadn't come down the way it did, if certain things hadn't happened how they did, who knows if we'd be talking about baseball today, 2025. But we've got so much more to come. In episode 2, the whispers become deals, money starts to move, and the fix takes the field. We'll take a closer look at some of the players, especially shoeless Joe Jackson and his enduring legacy. And with the recent decision by Commissioner Rob Manfred to lift the lifetime suspension, will Joe Jackson finally be elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame? That and so much more coming up in episode 2. And then episode 3, we'll wrap it up with the trial and the aftermath of the Black Sox scandal on the players and on baseball. Hope you've enjoyed this premiere episode. We hope to have episode 2 out in a couple of weeks. So if you're listening to this on Thanksgiving night, give us a couple weeks to record, and produce episode 2. But we're excited about our new series focusing on the history of baseball. We'd like to hear from you. Feedback on this episode, ideas for future series. We've got some that we're kicking around, but we would love to hear from our listeners as we always do. What are your thoughts on the Black Sox? What are your thoughts on Shoeless Joe? Tell us at baseballromantic77@gmail.com or message us on our Facebook page, Romantic About Baseball. Until next time, thank you for listening. Have a great holiday season, and we'll see you at the ballpark.